I began to see that a lot of the blockages in people's lives and a lot of what was holding them back, or the ways in which their lives could be better, were actually much more personal than it was political. So that's what I began to see. And I think in a lot of my writing, what I'm trying to do is to still validate politics and the political process, but to say if you're interested in change and people living better lives, it's not all about politics. In Glasgow, there is a gallus quality to Glaswegians, where they can be quite showy in some ways. I wouldn't necessarily talk about it as being very verbal. I think, well, this is about my Tears That Made the Clyde book, and I know that this is quite a controversial thing to say, but I think if people express themselves in quite a Glasgow way, it is actually quite abusive. It can be funny, but it's name-calling, it's labelling. We're really, really big into giving people labels in Glasgow. See you, you're a wee, whatever it might be, and it's often quite abusive. Argument. I think we've got a tendency in Scotland to very, very black and white thinking. I think that's different from saying the Scots' psyche is divided and schizophrenic in some way. I think we have a tendency to polarise, to see things in very, very black and white terms. And that's particularly true of individuals. So people are either worthwhile or they're worthless. And if you don't like something someone's doing, I think there's a tendency to damn the whole person, rather than to say, well, I don't like that aspect of what they're doing or saying. I think it's quite black and white. So it's about how you interpret good and bad events. So if a bad thing happens, do you think it's temporary or do you think it's permanent? Are we doomed, or is it just we've got a challenge? So he goes through this, and what's interesting is not just bad events, it's good events. So if a good thing happens, do you think it's going to last, or do you think it's just a fluke? And I think the way that he defines it, I think you can see that Scots have a tendency towards what he would consider to be pessimistic thinking. But what's interesting, I think, is it's particularly related to good events. So you can see this around football, for example, that if Scotland were to win against France, I think this did happen a few years ago, people will think that it's just a fluke and it's not going to last. Now you could say, well, it didn't, but it's not likely to if you don't think it will. I think some of this is about Scotland's particular history. Seligman, for example, talks about America as the land of optimists because it's optimists who emigrate. You have to be very optimistic to get on a boat, particularly in the old days, and go to another country. You really have to believe that life will be better if you do that. So if America's a land of optimists, what were we doing then during that period where we were one of the biggest exporters of people? I think we exported a lot of our optimists. And although we tend to think of emigration from Scotland as the clearances, that was actually the minority. The vast majority of people who left Scotland were the most skilled. Often they were the ones that had actually prospects here, but they thought they could have an even better future if they went. So I think some of this is about creaming off, as a result of this, some of the most optimistic people. What happened after 2003? When I wrote in 2000, I wrote the book between 2001 and 2003, and there seemed to be no chance that you were suddenly going to have the Scottish National Party as the main political force in Scotland. It never looked like that when I was writing, that was on the cards at all. So when they won in 2007, wasn't it? I was surprised by that, and I was aware that there did seem to be a bit of a rise in national self-confidence. And I think it was partly to do with the fact that we had a team of people now in control who were much more presentable, who were much better speakers, who were confident, and you weren't looking at the telly going, oh my God, does that represent psychology? And I think, some of that stuff about optimism has got something to offer us in Scotland. I mean, Seligman would say, whether you're an optimist or a pessimist or not, can account for as much as 7 years of life expectancy. This is very significant for us in a city like Glasgow, where there's areas where the life expectancy of men is 55. So I think that we should pay attention to some of that. But I'm not someone that says all of this is about psychology. I think culture, structure, inequality, all of that matters. When I wrote the Tears That Made the Clyde, I was partly inspired to do it by reading The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, which is basically arguing and presenting a great deal of evidence to say that the more equal societies do much better in terms of health and social outcomes and so on. And the argument that they put forward, which is totally speculative, they have no evidence for it, this is one of the reasons why they've been criticised quite a lot, but basically they're saying as human beings we have a need to be respected and included. And if that doesn't happen, you know, if you're living in a very unequal society and you feel you're at the bottom of the pile and you're being kind of trampled on by other people, the temptation then is to hit out at people that you perceive as even lower in the hierarchy than you are, right? So you get what they call the bicycling reaction of people then will pick on gays, or they'll beat their wives, or they'll beat up their kids, or they'll be racist or sectarian. And when I read what they said happened, I thought, this is Glasgow. You know, a macho culture with gangs, sectarian, you know, this, everything they're talking about goes along with inequality. It's Glasgow. And that's why I ended up writing The Tears That Made the Clyde, because we don't seem on the surface to be more unequal than cities like Manchester and Liverpool, but we have a history of it. And I think you can argue that. What Dorling is saying from his evidence is that we're now back at levels of income inequality that applied in Britain in 1854 when Charles Dickens was writing Hard Times. Now that doesn't mean to say that poverty is the same, but the inequality, that stark difference between rich and poor, is, I would like us to focus more on some of the huge challenges that we've got. And in Scotland, that would be child well-being. Child well-being is a major issue here. You know, we have got, partly because we've got a huge problem with alcohol and drugs. We're 6th in the world in terms of the use of drugs. And then we're 8th in the world in the use of alcohol. And there's no country that's higher, you know, than us if you combine the two lists. We're number 1 for alcohol and drugs. There's a huge issue about addiction in Scotland. People thought that Scotland would be protected from that because of the drink culture, that, you know, we wouldn't go down the drugs route. That hasn't been true. It's a major issue in Scotland. And when you talk to people who are working with children whose parents are alcohol and drug abusers, there is a major ticking time bomb here that we're not addressing. I think if you were to look at an area, not everyone's the same, and some people can grow up in exactly the same so-called deprived area, but actually go on and do well and go to university or whatever. And that will be down to some psychological characteristics, such as people being more optimistic, or having a growth mindset, or having the belief that if they work hard and they can do things. We actually, at one point, gathered self-esteem figures. One of the top performing schools in Scotland has got slightly lower self-esteem than our average for Scotland. So this is a really complicated issue. But once you think it matters, what you're likely to do is, as soon as a child is struggling with something, and anything that's worth learning is usually frustrating, you know, there's a struggle attached, what you'll do is you'll divert them onto easier work, because you think that you're keeping their self-esteem up, and further down the line, you don't. All you do is your standards go like that. I'm not particularly into a big aspirational culture. I believe that we need to pull together, work together better, but allowing people to be individuals within that, to achieve things collectively together. So I'm really much more of a collectivist than I am an individualist. I would like to see strong, you know, Scotland tackle some of the challenges that we have, become a stronger country, contribute to this debate that we vitally need to have about the kind of country that we're going to become, or the kind of culture that the Western civilization has to make changes to. I would love to see Scotland participate in that debate.